Hi, everyone. Welcome again. Just be patient with us. We'll give you a minute for everyone to settle in and check their tech before we start. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our last session for the day. And it's good to have you. We know it's been a long day, but happy to see you all back. And we're looking forward to a very engaging panel discussion today. But before then, I would like to quickly introduce our chair for this panel. So Diana Jones is a senior lecturer in criminology at the University of Melbourne. She teaches about prisons and punishment, young people, and the justice system. Her research is focused on the effects of criminalization, the impacts of imprisonment, the possibilities of restorative, relational, and reintegrative justice practices, and working with African Australian communities. Her book, Being and Becoming an Ex-Prisoner, was published in 2018. She has a husband, 3 daughters, 2 dogs, and a guinea pig. Thank you, Dinah, for availing yourself to chair this panel, and I'll hand over the rest of the discussions to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. I meant to add to that bio, probably take out the guinea pig, and add that I'm also working on a book. So just a shameless plug for my colleagues, co-writers and I. We're working on a book that is soon to be published called Race, Place and Politics, The Anatomy of a Law and Order Crisis, which will focus on the effects of the aftermath of the political lead up and the aftermath of the Moomba 2016 events in Melbourne. Anyway, good afternoon and welcome everybody. Enough about me. Welcome to this academic panel on communities on the first day of the panel presentations at this week's wonderful African Studies Group conference, Solidarity and Diversity, highlighting marginal voices in academia, practice and society. I think this is something we will all share a commitment to, the need to highlight and give platforms to voices that sometimes are not given enough amplification. My name's Diana Johns, as Matthew said, and as he told you, I'm a criminologist here, and I'm working with colleagues, including Kofi, I should declare that, and others in the room on a couple of different projects with African Australian communities. And one of which will be spoken about on Friday morning. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you on the unceded land of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, the Eastern Kulin Nation in Victoria. I assume everybody in Australia is on unceded Aboriginal land. And for those of us in other places, I imagine, Rebecca, too, you're on the land of unceded by First Nations people. So I pay respect to elders of all nations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and elders of all communities, both past and present. This is a really great panel. I'm ashamed to confess I haven't been part of the conference so far today. I've just for other things have prevented my attendance, but I look forward to this panel and to engaging with panels in the coming 2 days. So this panel on communities brings together 3 really diverse and interesting presentations. We're going to hear from Kofi Bediako, who is a PhD candidate in the School of Social and Political Sciences here at the University of Melbourne. Also a research assistant on numerous projects. His PhD research is focused on international intervention in post-conflict justice in Africa. And Kofi will talk about a project that I'm part of, Ubuntu in Practice, evaluating the Black Rhinos basketball project. Then we'll hear from Dr. Tebeje Molla, who is a DECRA fellow, a Discovery Early Career Research Award fellow in the School of Education at Deakin University, I understand, and leading research on African Australian refugee young people's engagement in higher education. So similar but different perspective on young people's inclusion and engagement in our broader community. And then we welcome Rebecca Mqamelo. Have I got the name? Have I got that right, Rebecca? Similar, sorry, I apologise for my mispronunciation. Rebecca's coming to us from San Francisco. It's very late at night, so thank you for making that time for sleeping this afternoon, Rebecca. Rebecca's originally from South Africa, but has worked in Kenya with the grassroots economics, and that's on the study that she'll be talking about with us today. So just briefly, some housekeeping or logistical points. We have 90 minutes together. We'll allow approximately up to 18 minutes each speaker. I will give you at 15-minute mark, I'll give you a 3-minute warning. So I'll just hold up this sign like that and hope that you see it presented. So look out for that. And and then at the end of 18 minutes, I'll go like this. And if you haven't noticed me, I might just unmute myself and let you know that it's time, just so that we have enough time at the end for some rich discussion. So audience members, please, I think we'll reserve all the discussion and questions till the end, but please, if you have a burning question during one of the first two presentations, and you can't wait till the end of the third, then use the chat function to write your question down, and we'll come back to that at the end. Otherwise, at the end, if you'd like to either use the chat function or you can use the raise hand function to indicate that you have a question. For those of you who are new to Zoom, I don't imagine that there are many of you left in the world, but if you are new to Zoom, just go down to the bottom of your screen to the reactions button, press that, and you'll see raise hand, and that will do this, raise hand, and then you can lower it again. And so otherwise, everybody, as you already have, please remain on mute unless you are asking a question at the end or unless you are presenting. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Kofi Bediako to talk about Ubuntu in practice. Thank you, Kofi.
Awesome, thank you. Let me quickly share my screen and all right. Thank you very much, Diana. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work, and pay respect to the elders past and present. Yeah, so I am presenting on behalf of the research team, myself, Patience, Dr. Gerald, and Diana herself, who is chairing our panel today. So let me begin by saying that this is not a complete evaluation program yet. We are at the data analysis stage now. So what I'm going to present is an overview of the project and our methods and what the next steps are. So by way of outline, it's going to be in two parts. So part one is a background to the Black Rhinos project itself, and it's the philosophical underpinning that guides the project, which is the African philosophy of Ubuntu. And I'll move on to part two, which talks about the evaluation project itself. So I'll give you back a little bit of the background to the evaluation, our conceptual approach, which is the realist evaluation approach, and then the practical aspect, that's how we actually did the research. And then I will touch on some few emerging themes in general terms for now, and then just give you what we are up to the next stage of our project. Right, so to begin with, the Black Rhinos basketball program is a community intervention program in the city of Greater Dandenong, which is managed by AfriOsCare. This is a community-based organization, and it's a community-based organization that recognized the relationship between resettlement challenges and the fact that African Australian youths do have a higher chances of coming into contact with the justice system. So it's some of the assessment it did was that resettlement challenges like complex traumas, because some of the African Australians might have come from refugee backgrounds. Some do have some difficult issues that probably force them to migrate in the first place. And then getting to Australia, being able to integrate also created another problem. So that gives room to what is normally called a complex trauma or unresolved trauma. There are also issues of dysfunctional families, especially the youth having problems with their parents, issues of lack of knowledge about what services are even available and how to even access these services. There is also the problem of racism and marginalization, and all feeding into a bigger problem of unemployment. So all these work together to create a problem for young African Australians and increases their chances of getting into contact with the justice system. So having done this assessment, AfriOsCare introduced the Black Rhinos program using Ubuntu as the guiding principle to offer a holistic service to young African Australians with the view of minimizing their chances of offending or reoffending or coming into contact with the justice system in general. So a bit about what Ubuntu means. Those who are familiar with traditional African societies, it's based on communalism or collectivism as opposed to individualism. That is, the entire community is viewed as one, and there is issues of, the approach to living together is mutual support and being there for each other, basically. So the notion that captures this lifestyle is what is commonly called Ubuntu. So Ubuntu main philosophical understanding is that our humanity, our being human is complete only in the presence of others. We are never complete as individuals until there are other people around us. Therefore, there is that connectivity, that relationship between among people. The commonest expression that we normally hear about Ubuntu is, I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am. This is opposed to the Western philosophical understanding of I am, therefore I am, which is another expression for individualism.
Kofi, can I ask you to press slideshow so that we have the full view of your screen?
Yes. My apologies.
I
thought, all right. Okay, right. Oh, so let me go quickly to where I was then. Yeah. Right. Okay. Sorry for the interruption. I needed to be back on track. Right. So viewed in the Australian context, we see the African Australian individual, that is the young person, as represented by the yellow label, and that individual's overall personhood is made up of their connection with their family, the society, the community, and then the wider society. So what is the relationship between the Black Rhinos project and the concept of Ubuntu? The underlying assumption is that African Australians who have migrated, those who have migrated to the Australian community have lost the Ubuntu that guided their lifestyle back at home. Because as I indicated earlier, the traditional setup is such that there is that communal living, that communal support. And the people have migrated from that system to a system where life is based on the principle of individualism and each one for himself. So they are seen to have lost that sense of mutual support. And that then increases their chances of being in contact with the justice system, as I indicated earlier. So the project assumption is that the basketball will be used as a rallying point that brings together the youth so that they are able to connect with others, because they might have lost connection with people, especially people who are more engaged with society. Because even though they might be within certain groups and the like, these are not groups that augur well for their development. So the idea is to bring them to a different group that is made up of like-minded people, people who have the similar experiences, so that as they connect and share experiences, they will be able to reorient themselves towards pro-social lifestyles. Right. So it also provides the idea of home away from home, especially for young people who may have issues with families. One of the issues that came up was that these young people normally would have problems with their families because of their contact with the justice system. Some families would become fed up with their children and wouldn't even want to entertain them in their house. So Afrios Care serves to welcome such people and in a non-judgmental way. So that through this approach, the young person will be able to be guided so that they gradually accept or engage with society and integrate into the Australian society better. Yeah, so this is the story as told by the practitioners, that is Afrios Care. So that is where we come in. And I now introduce part 2, where our evaluation project comes in. So our evaluation project is a collaboration between the Department of Justice and the University of Melbourne. That's the team that I've already introduced. And then the practitioners, Afrios Care. So the idea is to evaluate the project, looking at how it is implemented. So the implementation process, as well as its social impact. What are the outcomes? And the approach is using realist evaluation method. And the idea is to try to understand what works for whom and in what circumstances. So the findings from the evaluation project will be used to improve the program, as well as look at ways of expanding or adapting it in different contexts. So a quick background to realist evaluation. So realist evaluation holds that social programs always have some theoretical underpinnings. Whether it is explicitly stated or implicit, there is always some theoretical thinking around social interventions. Therefore, realist evaluation examines these theoretical assumptions to look at how they impact the outcomes that are normally attributed to these social programs. Realist evaluation adopts the explanatory focus of what works for whom and in what circumstances, as I mentioned earlier. And it begins by hypothesizing in advance what mechanisms operate on the ground, what are the contextual circumstances, and then what are the expected outcomes. So going by the realist approach, we began with our hypothesis. And our hypothesis was that the application of Ubuntu in the design and implementation of the Black Rhinos basketball program has made it effective in as a bridging platform for African and other migrant youth in the Dandenong community to navigate the challenges of integrating into the Australian society successfully. We then had to look at whether this hypothesis would hold at the end of the day. So our methodology. Our methodology is divided into two. So we have the process evaluation aspect, and then we have the outcome aspect. So under the process evaluation, we were interested in looking at how the needs of the young people were assessed in the first place. So here we engaged with management. We also looked at how the program was designed and the planning and designing stage, also working with management on that, and also mobilization of resources. And then we looked at intake assessment. How does the young person get accepted into the basketball program? What kind of processes are they taken through, and what philosophical or conceptual approaches are applied at that stage? And then we looked at the implementation of the program itself. How is the basketball program and other related activities that the Afrios Care provide, how are they implemented? And after looking at that, we then looked at what are the outcomes of all of that intervention. And here the focus, the primary focus was on the participants, that is those who are participating in the basketball program. And there, at that stage, we were looking at direct impact on them, especially in terms of their health, their psychological well-being, and the like. And we also looked at how that relates to their families. So as I mentioned earlier, some of them initially had family issues. So we proceeded to look at whether there has been that improvement, there has been reconnection with their families, and peace is reigning, or whatever the current state is. We also looked at what are the long-term outcomes. That is how the young people are now able to connect with their community, participate in community activities and the like. And finally, we looked at the broader picture, that is their participation in wider society. And here we were interested in things like whether they are now in jobs or they are undertaking volunteering, internship and the like, such that they are connecting with the society and contributing positively. So we used 3 main methods. So the first is document review. So reviewing some of the reports that the practitioner, that is Afros Care, has written about how they do their things. And then we did interviews, focus groups, and then one-on-one interviews as well. We also did observation, which included direct observation as well as participant observation. Unfortunately, I didn't take pictures of my engagement at the basketball grounds. The first day I tried to throw the ball, I realized that I don't really know anything at all. So yeah, but the picture in your shot, that is the research team. Yeah, but we also went to the basketball grounds to engage with them, try to, as I said, also throw some balls here and there, and then look at how they are engaging with each other, the kind of conversations, and then we will be taking those and the like, right? So that was how we collected our data, and we are currently at our evaluation stage, and the data analysis stage. And so far, some of the themes that have emerged include safe space. So the young people see the program as a place where they feel welcome, they are not judged, and it serves as home for them. There is also the theme of support, where there is somebody there they can call anytime they need something. There is also the theme of connection. That is, as you can see in your picture there, some of the young people, I think in this picture, they had just won one of their top competition. The one to the extreme right is their coach, that is Ryan. So you can see them happily engaging. And so the theme of friendship and family and community has also come up. There has also been the theme of restoration, where some of them talk about they rediscovering some sense of purpose and having some hope that they can be able to have a good life. Because the status quo ante was that they had lost hope. They felt rejected in the Australian society. And so this program, reconnecting them and bringing them together with other like-minded people and providing support, helped them to restore some sense of hope and discover their sense of purpose. There has also been the theme of employment that have come up strongly. And well, everybody wants to get a job and contribute positively to society. It's important that I think that is coming up, because in most cases, some of the issues that cause friction between migrants and host communities is the idea that most migrants are just dependent on the central government, and so and not willing to contribute to the economic development. So it is important that most of them are eager to get jobs rather than depend on government. There is also the theme of expansion. So this came mostly from community leaders who think that the problem is really huge. There are a lot of young people who are still there who need help. So AfriOS alone cannot do this. So we need more of such programs across Australia to help young African Australians to minimize their chances of coming into contact with the justice system. Yeah. So that is how far we have come with regards to our analysis. And, where we are now, as I mentioned earlier, is we are still working on our data analysis. And beyond that, we will then report to the Department of Justice and probably have the opportunity of disseminating the report to through other avenues, maybe conferences like this one later. Yeah, so that is that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kofi. Thank you very much. And that was very well timed. I don't know if you saw my little signs or not, but it was perfect. Great. So now I'd like to welcome Dr. Tebeje Molla to talk about partial inclusion, how racial othering undermines the integration of African Australian youth. Thank you, Tebeje. I'll give you the sign at 15 minutes to say you have 3 minutes to go.
Yeah, sorry, I muted myself. Thanks, Diana, and welcome everyone to our session. And my name is Tebeje Molla. I'm a research fellow in the School of Education at Deakin University. Before I start my presentation, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm coming to you and pay my respect to their elders, past and present. My presentation, or this analytical reflection, mainly draws on the projects I'm currently leading, which focus on higher education attainment of African refugees as a mark, as also a means of integration. I take first of this outline. The presentation has 4 sections. I introduce as introduction. I'll speak a bit on the Australian migration program, followed by a section on the racialization of youth violence, and the third one, drawing implications of racialization of violence for integration of African refugee background African youth array, and then close with concluding remarks. I took this from Lemon Sisai, a British Ethiopian poet, who says, "We are all immigrants like the birds." I really agree with that. Although the epistemology of migration is associated with what birds do, migration is actually a critical part of human experience. We have always been on the move, and that wouldn't change, I think. What's perhaps new here and now is the magnitude and dimension of human migration with the politics of nationalism or the identity politics and populism on the one hand and mass displacement on the other. We're really in a critical time. When it comes to Australia, the Australia is one of the top 10 destination of international migration, according to the OECD. In fact, around 60% of the population growth is attributable to international migration. The Australian migration program has 2 components, for skilled and family entrants and for the humanitarian entrants. This paper specifically focuses on humanitarian entrants from Africa. As you may know, humanitarian entrants arrive in destination societies through a range of pathways, through UNHCR and private sponsorship, direct government humanitarian admission, or asylum routes. But what really matters is what nation states can offer in terms of integrating the humanitarian terms. In the case of Australia, despite the availability of generous settlement and integration programs and services, integration outcomes of African refugees, as Kofi's presentation before me indicated, and my own research shows, the integration outcome of African refugees remains very low, and young Africans are often subjected to the politics of racial othering. In this presentation, I highlight the implications of racial othering for integration outcomes of refugee background African youth. But what do we mean by racialization of violence? Well, Diana and everyone else here will support me on this. I'm not an expert in criminology, but my reading suggests that racialization refers to the process of ascribing racial meaning to social problems. And it is an act of centering race to explain and describe social problems, including violence and criminal activities. People racialize violence when they frame the causes and perpetrators of criminal activities along racial lines with the purpose of othering the minority and triggering anxiety in the majority with political gain in mind. As you can see in this image, racialization is underpinned by racial prejudice. When your action and behavior is guided by racial prejudice, you don't see the person in front of you. What you see is the cast of your own prejudice as a scary shadow that you see on this image. When it comes to the experience of African youth in Australia, following the street violence and other incidents of burglary that involve some members of African youth, conservative politicians and media outlets often resorted to racialized labeling. Black African youth are often represented as inherently violent and dangerous. Those racialization processes are often enacted through political debates, but mainly through media coverage, but sometimes also through legislations. I will cover all those three later on. But let's see, for example, this is my survey of leading conservative media outlets and how they covered the issue of youth violence in Australia in the last 6 years. You can see how they are presented as inherently violent. And even the land virus thrives in multiculturalism. Even in this time of pandemic, we are not escaped from the labeling game. But just also see the texts marked in green: terrify, scared, terrorize, warfare. These are the metaphors used to describe African youth in this country. But this is not limited to the media. The political space equally suggests that top politicians, including prime ministers and other cabinet members, use the same language to represent African youth or describe African youth, like African gang problem, Sudanese gang, African gang violence, African youth gangs. But having said that, I want to make 2 points. One is racial stigma and racialization of violence is not new or unique to African youth. In fact, there is a fascinating literature that maps the trends and shifts in the racial blame game. For example, in the 1950s and the 60s, racial stigma was often directed at people from Southern Europe area. Then in 1970s and 80s, with the arrival of refugees from Vietnam, then the blame shifted into the Asian crime gang. Then in the 1990s and 2000s, with the arrival of many refugees from the Middle Eastern region, the violence or the racialization level was associated with Middle Eastern Muslim young men. Then following from the mid 2000s, the turn is to Africans. So This is a continuing issue. The second point that I want to make is that you may think, yes, those racial stigma and othering are championed by media people or politicians who have their own agenda, but don't be mistaken with that. There are educated stereotypes and prejudice as well. Here we have the infamous scholar from the University of Macquarie University in Sydney, who said actually the increasing number of Africans in this country is a recipe for increased crimes, and even who warned that it's a path to national suicide. And his solution was keep them out. Another professor describing the problem of African refugees to the journalist, saying most of the young people engage in crime activities because Australian jails provide a better living conditions than their original home. There are also think tanks. Visits some of the comments by people from the Center for Independent Studies. You will find the same language targeting African youth as criminals. So this is a background, but what is the implication to integration outcomes of the group? Racial othering is really consequential. The theoretical and empirical literature in sociology, criminology, cultural studies, and social psychology show that when people are exposed to sustained racial stigma, they struggle to integrate. They struggle to meaningfully engage with the dominant or a majority society. This is the case with African youth. Drawing on the literature and also using my own data, I identify 5 elements of connection to explain the implications of racialization of violence for integration outcomes of African youth. The first one is racial stigma undermines cultural citizenship. Here, cultural citizenship is defined as the right to be different without compromising one's right to belong. It is the freedom from stigma and other racialized representation. In social contexts, in diverse social contexts, such as in Australia, when racial stigma persists, people feel isolated and they tend to move to the margin and remain there. And marginal existence is an ideal place to breed all ranges of social issues and social ills. Racial stigma also injures dignity, respect and recognition as critical values of humanity. Regardless of your religious background or cultural origin, we all yearn for recognition. For minority groups, recognition means the capability to be recognized or accepted as they name themselves. Deprivation of recognition and respect is so damaging, according to Alex Honez, because it impairs our positive self-understanding. It diminishes our self-esteem. It diminishes our self-efficacy, and thereby affects our aspiration in life, our aspiration for our future, for our family. Life with low aspiration in life and in your future is really a negative input for integration outcomes. If you are not aspirant, if you don't have hope in your life, you don't see any relevance in your engagement with members of the society around you. So it really affects integration directly. So racial stigma and othering and racialization of violence also diminishes affiliation. Philosopher Martha Nussbaum identifies affiliation as one of the 10 core human capabilities. People are affiliated to a particular group or they feel they belong when they have real ability to engage meaningfully, and when they have the social base for self-respect and dignity, especially for refugees who are uprooted from their material resources, cultural roots, and social networks. Affiliation in the destination society is really of great importance. But when they don't get that opportunity to belong, to engage, to interact with the local population, they impose self-isolation on themselves, and then they disengage. Not only that, at worst, people who feel isolated and disengaged can also develop oppositional attitude towards expectations and institutions of society. For example, in the case of African youth, African-born population in Victoria represent about 1.5% of the state's population. But according to a report in 2018, in the youth correction centers of the state, African youth represent 19%. This is a report from 2018. This tells you how lack of affiliation, lack of belonging, just a sense of belonging would lead you to. Racial stigma also reinforces racial microaggressions. You see, when people in power, politicians, media personalities, intellectuals openly propagate or champion negative narratives about a specific racial group, ordinary people find it easy, even acceptable, to mistreat members of that group. Racialization of violence also distorts public perception of Black people. In other words, racialization of violence burdens Black people with a presumption of guilt. Anyone can be trusted if they point their finger towards somebody else, just a Black person, as committing something. I would like to highlight two reports. One is the social cohesion mapping reports from this year. A sizable number of respondents of that survey indicates that they held negative views towards Australians of African heritage. That, in my view, is in part due to the racialization of violence. If you read newspapers saying every morning, you read newspapers with headlines, the African crime gang, and watch your evening news from Channel 7, reporting on African gangs again, then obviously you are a human being, you make your opinion about that specific group. Finally, racial violence also distorts the social cognition of policymakers. See, working with racial peers, when politicians, policymakers, their views are colored by racist views towards a specific group, they are unlikely to produce any transformative instrument to change the condition of those disadvantaged societies. In other words, when your views are blurred with the narratives of racism and racial views, you are unlikely to appreciate the socio-cultural challenges that specific community is facing. Even worse, sometimes you may produce policies to punish those group of people. You know, from 2007, there were calls to cut Australians' intake from African refugees. There is currently a bill in the parliament that enables the government to deport young people who are on the basis of character test. So really, the racialization of this violence distorts social cognition of policymakers. In doing that, it reproduces the disadvantage of African refugees and thereby undermines integration outcomes of refugees. Just to finish, in conclusion, I argue that racial othering negatively affects integration outcomes of refugee background African youth, and racialization of violence is antithetical to the nation's espoused political project that is multiculturalism. For to ensure full inclusion of migrants, whether they are forced or voluntary. We really need to provide fair access to socioeconomic opportunities, equal right to respect and recognition, and most importantly, we need to achieve a sustained advocacy work that calls for public action. Because as Glenn Lowry in his brilliant book on on racial inequality, he said, people do not freely give the presumption of equal humanity. This is also the story of liberal democracy. All the rights and freedom and liberties we enjoy in this society, in this country, didn't come for free. It's a demanded struggle and advocacy and movement. And I hope with sustained advocacy work and campaign, we can achieve equal right to respect and recognition for all in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Tebeje, for a very thoughtful presentation. I really liked just starting with Lem Sisay's "We are all immigrants like the birds" too. Lots of emerging themes to be discussed at the end of our next presentation. And I welcome Rebecca to talk about community inclusion currencies as crisis response, results from a randomized control trial in Kenya. Rebecca, over to you.
Thank you. Just going to share on screen. All right, I hope you can all see that. First of all, yeah, before I start, I just wanted to say I feel like I've learned so much. So I'm not from, I don't live in Australia. I've actually never been myself. But I just wanted to thank Kofi and Tebeje, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, on just giving us more context on what it's like to grow up as an African youth in that country. My presentation is going to be slightly different. It has nothing to do with Australia. Maybe one day it will. I don't know if any of you are familiar with community currencies, but I recently finished a study with the Grassroots Economics Foundation. They are operating in Kenya, and they basically use cryptocurrencies and novel blockchain technology for development aims. And the randomized control trial that we just finished up was the first of its kind. So still speaking about community, I'm going to be focusing on how communities are leveraging these kinds of tools, specifically in the economic and financial realm, and why that is so important in conjunction with these kinds of social projects that we often focus on. So to get started, maybe just to give you a bit of an overview of the kind of project that I was working on, there are really two objectives here, which was firstly just to evaluate community currencies as a form of cash transfers. So cash transfers are typically used in times of emergencies or as a development tool where you airdrop money and see how people use that. So as opposed to giving in-kind assistance, for example, the question really becomes, can you empower people socially and economically just by giving them money? And then the second objective of the study was really just to pilot a remote randomized control trial. So typically with these studies, you'll do lots of baseline surveys, but obviously this was during COVID, so we were constrained by that. And we had the advantage of using a network where we had a lot of data because it was based on blockchain. And to give some context on why community currency as opposed to any other form of cash, of aid in general, they are often context specific, right? So there isn't a hierarchy. There's a lot of debate within academia of is in-kind assistance better or is cash transfer better? And then with cash transfer, what about unconditional cash transfers, right? So we don't tell people that in order to get the $500, you first have to send your children to school. We'll just give it to you anyway. Community currencies go a step further because we're not just giving you money, we're also giving you a form of money that you can only spend locally with other members of that community currency network. And in this case, Grassroots Economics was the developer of that community currency network. So they've been working in Kenya for the last 10 years or so. And their thesis, or let's rather call it hypothesis, is that poverty is largely a structural problem as well. So we tend to look at all these social factors like access to healthcare, access to education, nutrition, but there is a way that you could spin that question and say, well, how would that change if, for example, money moved around more frequently between members of the community. I know I had this experience myself. I grew up in South Africa. I'm biracial, so my family on my dad's side would be in the village, and I have this memory of my grandmother taking her pension every month and then traveling to a town 50 kilometers away and spending that money there. That money was never seen by the local economy. That money was never spent at buying vegetables from your neighbor or buying from the local store. And this is kind of the problem in most local economies, is that they stagnate because money just doesn't circulate very often. So grassroots economics is the hypothesis as well. What if you created a form of currency that people would only use internally within that community? And you're basically increasing the velocity of money. The catch with them, though, is that they decided in 2018 that they also wanted to put this on a blockchain. And there are several advantages of that. The first one being that it's digital. They're operating in Kenya, so people are already used to using things like M-Pesa. There wasn't that much of a technology gap. And of course, the fact that you now have much more detailed analytics on how people are actually using this new form of money. And just to give you some stats, they have over 50,000 people across Kenya using these networks, trading on a daily basis, using what essentially is cryptocurrencies. And they've moved over $3 million worth of volume. This is just trading between local businesses. And then, of course, alongside to airdropping these community currencies, there are also all these local projects around agroforestry and empowering local SMEs. And in the picture there, you can see an example of what it would look like. So that's how you know that this business, I think in this case it was a hair salon, is part of the Sarafu network, where Sarafu is the name of the community currency that they're using. So back to the study that I did with grassroots economics. This was specifically during COVID, and the study happened between November and December 2020, where you were starting to see a lot of the aftermath of COVID. And the background context there is that a lot of organizations and NGOs around the world found themselves having to pivot to a cash-based response because of that inability to physically go into places because of the health risks. So by June 2020, you saw 277 cash transfer programs worldwide, when 98 of them had existed before the onset, and 179 were created entirely as a response to the pandemic. So there was, of course, a precedent for pivoting to this. Except with community currencies, you do have this added advantage of real-time data tracking. It's cheaper, it's faster. Being able to do the cash transfer happens, a couple of seconds because it's on blockchain. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with the cash transfer world, but if you look at the data and just the amount of money that gets spent on doing the transfers and all the overhead costs, you can run into thousands of dollars. So the entire budget for this program was less than $6,000. And two research questions we had here was, firstly, is this even an effective form of recovery as a tool? Are community currencies akin to cash transfers? And then secondly, what are the differences that we see between genders? Because we know that the effect of COVID has been very gendered across the globe. This is the kind of data that we had. So the nice thing about using the blockchain is you could see, for example, were women trading with other women, were men trading with other men, what was the category of the transactions that they were buying? So were they spending it on food, were they spending it on education, and wallet balances? And the reason that I can safely share this with you all is that all of this information is actually public and anonymized. You can go to grassrootseconomics.com/research. You can take a look at this data, and they've got some really interesting visualizations there. So that's also perhaps another way in that this is unique, is that it is actually publicly accessible as well. But because this was a remote RCT, there was some unique aspects. So phase one is we looked at obviously filtering out our treatment and control wallets. We had some basic criteria. So for example, these people had to be active for at least 30 days on the community currency network. We didn't want to be giving money to people who weren't even trading at all. That would obviously just be a waste. Phase two was doing the actual token transfers. So this happened over 3 consecutive weeks over a 1-month period. And the total amount was just under $30. And to give you an idea, in Kenya, that could $10 even, if you're looking at a 1-week period, could gladly secure your family meals every single day. So this money does go quite a long way. And then phase 3 of the study was around February 2021, where we did an actual cohort analysis of looking at what were some of the effects of the treatment versus the control group. And just to give you an idea of where this was happening, this was only restricted to Nairobi. So Grassroots Economics does actually operate throughout Kenya in rural and urban areas. But for the purposes of constraining the size, we looked at around 791 users in total, 389 in the treatment group and 402 in the control. So more or less balanced, as well as along gender lines. And finally, you're wondering what on earth do these transfers and airdrops actually mean? The way that people were using this was in the way that they've been using USSD codes on their phone. So they'd get a notification, you've just been given 400 Sarafu tokens, which was the equivalent of about $10. And then whenever they would place a trade, they would physically go to someone. So if I wanted to buy food from someone selling on the street, I would simply plug that into my cell phone, just like sending an SMS. It's relatively easy to take part of. And of course, these are all existing members, so there was no real education gap there. And of course, the most interesting part is what were the actual results? So 2 months after doing these airdrops, we saw very positive increases in spending in general, but specifically in terms of income, average trade size. So a really big part of why you'd want people to be trading within a constrained community in the first place is that you want them to be or to have more economic activity. So if they're spending more, that's more money that's circulating hands. And then interestingly, also increases in expenditure on food and water, which of course during COVID is really important. However, there were also strong gender differences, and these really can't be ignored. So while women did have positive effects in general, you did see that they were significantly lower than those for men. And of course, there are a couple of explanations here. First is just that COVID-19 really has been the hardest on women. There's been other research throughout this time, or throughout this period, where women have reported spending more time on things like caregiving. And the fact that a lot of people lost their source of employment during this period. Women were often the biggest part of that cohort. So just generally decreased income generating opportunities, less opportunity to be making money and perhaps even to be using the money that they're given. And what this looked like, for example, here you can see where we have average trade size. Generally for men, it was like $8 more than the treatment group, whereas for women, it was only $2 more. So still a positive effect, but still significantly lower than for men. And interestingly, marginal propensity to consume also suggests a preference to save given unpredictable cash flows. And this is simply a metric that would ask, well, what is the rate of the income that you're receiving that you're deciding to save? And because it was negative, that actually tells us that you're saving more than consuming. And what conclusion here would really just be that small scale transfers don't necessarily account for gender empowerment. They might be good as a buffer tool, but you can't really rely on them to level out the playing field. I also do want to acknowledge that there are limitations to this research. This was definitely a very novel area, given that we were looking at community currencies based on a blockchain. So this is unique to begin with, especially a unique set of participants who are already part of this network and already used to using this form of money. But of course, for every outcome that's denominated in community currencies, there are probably unknown outcomes in national currency, which unfortunately this data just doesn't tell us. So there's a lot of scope for extra research here. And then of course, the fact that this happened during COVID, I think this is an aggregate shock that would be very difficult to replicate, and hopefully we will never have to replicate or even be able to replicate. But when it comes to empirical research, and especially database research like this, it's really important that we do get to test some of these conclusions. And just to give you an idea, community currency research, while it is definitely growing, research that pertains to cryptocurrencies or blockchains is virtually non-existent. And I think in the spirit of this conference around, well, what is actually important and where do we share more limelight of who gets to tell the research, this is definitely an area that I think could benefit from more people putting out data, analyzing data, and then also doing the studies, which are so necessary for effective impact evaluation. I really hope that you get some sense of what this is all about, because I think when oftentimes people think of cryptocurrencies or they think of blockchains, they often think of the purely financial investment use case. And I myself work for an investing app, but I also am interested in the academic research. And there are so many of these little projects started around that are actually applying these tools in very novel, very innovative, pioneering ways. But you know what, you're not going to read about them in Forbes. So you heard it first here. And if you have any questions afterwards, please do feel free to ask me. Thanks.
Thank you, Rebecca. Again, such an interesting, something I know nothing about, such an interesting presentation, opening up the world of community currency and cryptocurrency in a real way that I can sort of start to get a handle on. Something that seems abstract.
Yeah.
So would everybody, I know Tebeje is having some issues with your
Yeah,
internet.
am I back?
Yes, you're back. We can hear you. Are we able to see you too?
Yes, you can see me now, but I canceled the video to avoid this, but it keeps still going.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we might get you to take your mic off anyway and join the panel for some discussion. We have, what time is it? We have almost half an hour to ask questions and have some discussion and pull out some threads or themes. I don't see any questions in the chat, so I'll ask if anybody in the room would like to raise their hand, if anyone has a question to ask either Kofi, Tebeje or Rebecca. A specific one about a presentation or a general one. Vincent, yes. Vincent, Kofi, would you like to ask?
Yeah, thank you, Diana, and thanks, Kofi, and there was Rebecca and then Tebeje for those inciting and presentations. My question goes to Kofi. Kofi, I think that presentation was really an initiative, was really an interesting bridging initiative to bring people together and to empower them for some sense of hope and all that. But I'm just wondering, so with this issue of difficulty to integrate and the challenges that confront migrant African youth, I think it's something that is indeed common in different parts of Australia. And in the presentation, for instance, you did cited or stated categorically that the project is sort of based in Dandenong, yeah, within the Dandenong community. And I'm just wondering, I would just like to ask, what informed the choice of that particular community for this project and not any other? Is there any unique, what was the criteria for the project focusing or centering in Dandenong and not Footscray or and not any other community that must have been facing similar challenges? Yeah.
Oh, I probably would have to call on Dr. Gerald. Dr. Gerald, are you there? Maybe you can.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah. So I think that's a very good question, Vincent. Yeah. And as you've said, it's kind of in terms of Australia, it's kind of national. What informed Dandenong is AfriOz Care and Selba. Selba is the kind of the owner or leader or CEO of AfriOz. They were actually now they are based in Springvale. They used to be in Dandenong. So they were doing so many programs. So the Black Rhinos basketball was just one of them. So it was that locality of AfriOz Care that led us there. So the basketball boys used to, before COVID, used to do their training at Dandenong High School. So it was, yeah, it just happened. So there was no scientific or, yeah, it was just, it happened that Selba and AfriOz Care were based in Dandenong. So it seemed appropriate. And I think Dandenong, and you might know this, Dandenong has got quite a number of Africans living around that area. So it seemed appropriate, I think. I don't think, is that the answer you are looking for, Vincent?
Oh, well, I think I'm just interested in the choice of the research area and the focus area, and probably maybe I thought maybe there must be something about the place and which draws attention and not any other place. But just a quick follow-up, if I'm allowed, Diana.
Sure. I might add something to that, to the last point as well, but ask your question first.
Okay, so just, thank you. Just a quick follow-up. So for instance, so with the people, the migrant youth and individuals that are included in the basketball project, for instance, I'm just thinking, so is there like a timeline within which they are expected to, like the purpose or the goals that you, exactly, to complete the whole process, and such that they, within such timelines, they're able to integrate, get a job, and be able to be empowered and live their lives as a normal? Is that like something like that, or it's as and when you feel okay that you drop off, or something like that? I don't know. Yeah.
Maybe Diana would add, you said you wanted to add something to what Gerard said before this one?
Sure, okay, thanks, Kofi. I was just going to add why AfriOzCare, why Dandenong, Vincent, in response to your first question. Partly it was because a previous piece of work through a previous piece of work, we had developed a relationship with, or Gerald had really, a relationship with AfriOzCare that happened to coincide with the particular interest of the state government in African youth as a so-called, as a demonized and stigmatized group. So any work that was being done at that grassroots level was attracting state government attention when it was being claimed to be incredibly successful, as AfriOzCare was. So it was some of that attention that that Selva's work was gathering that really drew the attention of the state government and meant that they were interested in evaluating that to find out what was actually going on. Kofi, over to you.
All right, thank you. All right, so Vincent, with your second question, no, there is no completion point. If you noticed in the presentation, I indicated that they operate on the model of home away from home. So the idea is that, well, you never graduate from your home. You are a permanent member. So once you become a member of the Black Rhinos project, you are considered a member for life unless you want to leave yourself. And they would want to provide you with all the services that they can provide and that you would want to avail yourself. They do not force anybody. It is voluntary entry and voluntary exit, but nobody would ask anybody to leave. So yeah, that's how it is.
Okay, thank you. The reason I asked that question is because I'm thinking about in terms of the capacity and the transitioning point, because if there are no timelines, for instance, and you keep enrolling people, I'm just wondering in terms of sustainability and how people get to transition to make way for probably others to also, that is what informed. Yeah, so thank you.
Yeah, I think that is an important concern, and it appears it is even biting already, because in our interaction with them, they've already indicated that they really need to expand, because they are now having 3 different groups. So, and they are having only, they have access to only 1 stadium, or I think 2. So they are trying to build their own center. And if they keep on operating on the same model, probably their own center would still not be able to accommodate them in the future. So yes, maybe they will be forced to rethink some time to come. But for now, the idea is that it is based on the African concept of Ubuntu, which is welcoming everybody. We are all related and it's a family for everybody. So.
Thank you. I think Kennedy, your hand was up next, and then Franca.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Chair, and thanks to the panelists for very interesting and very fascinating presentations. Tended to ask everyone a question, but I'll only limit myself to one. So Rebecca, that was a very interesting project on using high-power technology such as blockchain to address some very basic but profound issues. So reflecting on the project, what was it? How did the community members relate with the technology from the onset? And was that constant, or did that relationship change over time? And how was that relationship between the high power technology vis-a-vis the needs that you were trying to address?
Yeah, so I think I'd actually answer this from the perspective of, well, let's say from the entire timeline of Grassroots Economics' work. So when they first came in, I think it was around 2009, they were working with, was mostly local environmental groups. They started off with a very rudimentary concept. It was like, if you plant trees, you'll be able to earn community currency. And at that time, it was actually physical pieces of paper, which you could argue have more of like a tangible emotional pull to the people that are using them, because they would be involved in little things like the design. They would bring on women's groups, they would bring on church groups, and that's sort of how they started growing. But it's a very interesting question that you asked, because it wasn't always a very smooth process, right? We're looking at the snapshot of 10 years of working with some of these communities. So in terms of how they relate to grassroots economics, they're very familiar with them. Some communities, you obviously being more active than others. And interestingly, you see this a lot in rural areas, where it could be farmers cooperatives that have taken on these community currencies and sort of form their local business models around them. And I'll give you an example here. The Red Cross has done tons of programs throughout Kenya, just in general. And they had this one program where they were doing it was sort of like plant things, be involved in agricultural projects, and then they would pay you. And that pay for work program actually ended. And problem in many of these communities is, as soon as these very large NGO projects end, the money dries up, and whatever project they're working on isn't very sustainable because it just disappears. This was an example of one farmers cooperative that came from that Red Cross program, and just so happened to hear about grassroots economics at the same time, and said, okay, well, let's try this community currency. We'll continue doing our farmers cooperative. We'll bring in this new currency. We'll try and onboard people and kickstart this sort of local circulation of currency. And so that's one example where there's a lot of ownership as well from the community. And those tend to be the ones where you see a lot more trade activity. In this case, it was farmers cooperatives in urban Nairobi. There's a lot more onboarding of schools. So where schools will partially pay teachers' salaries, for example, in community currency. The last time that I did physical fieldwork in Kenya was in 2019, and listening to some of these interviews, I think there's a lot of positive feedback around, as a business owner, I can now accept more customers because I can allow them to pay 50-50 in community currency and national currency. But of course, that isn't to say that this is a perfect system, right? I mean, for many of the participants in the Sarapo network, they have to now balance having two currencies, right? Which is not something that many of us have to experience on a day-to-day basis. And people have found all sorts of intricate ways around how they do that. So there's often this psychological separation between my saving money, which would be my national currency, my Kenyan shillings, right? I can put that into a bank account. I can exchange M-Pesa for that. And then my spending money, which is my community currency, because that's the money that I spend locally, right? That's the money I will buy groceries with or pay my child's school fees with other members of the community currency network. But I mean, maybe just one other anecdote that I will give you is, I do know in the beginning, there was a lot of resistance to this. All sorts of things of, okay, this is just another NGO coming in to do something that isn't going to be sustainable. And I think there's been a very slow, gradual, but very positive process of building trust. And as well, because it is a community currency, this is something that literally only works if it is community owned, right? So if the community doesn't trust it or doesn't like it, they're not going to use it, and it's going to fail. So the communities and the 50,000 plus people that you see using this on a day-to-day basis are people that do so because they believe in it, and do so because they know that if they go to their neighbor with this community currency, their neighbor isn't going to turn them away and say, don't give me fake money. Their neighbor knows that they can accept that currency and then go pay to the next one. So I hope that sort of answers your question.
That's great, thank you. Franca, did you have a question?
Yes, I did. So my question is to Kofi and his team. I thought the program is really, really interesting and very important work that you guys are doing. But as a fan of basketball myself, of MBL in Australia and MBA in the US, and relating that to the work that the MBA, for example, is trying to do in Africa and others. I'm wondering whether this program, beyond is serving as a space for these young people to sort of get together and all of that, does it also serve as a scouting ground for like talent for basketball? And I don't know whether you can comment on that, or that is beyond the scope of the program. Thank you.
Yes. I think I will need a lawyer on this one again.
Kofi, let me try Kofi.
Okay.
So that's a good question, Franca. Some of the good boys do graduate to MBL competitive. So there is some kind of pathway to competitive basketball. Though, as Kofi has highlighted in his presentation, this is much more than basketball in the program. But looking at the basketball skills, there is a pathway to MMBL. And maybe I should mention, I'm not sure now if it's happening, but this program was initially funded by Basketball Australia. So there was an interest from the National Basketball Body on the skills of these young people. So yeah, that's what I have to say for that.
Thank you for the insight. I think I might need to find more information about that, but thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Gerald and Kofi and Franca. Charlene, do you have a question?
Hi there. Thanks to all the presenters. They were all really terrific presentations. I have a question for Rebecca. I'd never heard of any of what you were talking about today, so it was fascinating. But I was wondering, I was wondering whether there might be any unintended consequences in. So what we're seeing a lot in Melbourne with everyone homeschooling is that it's really exacerbating that sort of digital divide between people with access to devices and people without. And I'm just wondering whether a program like yours might be excluding the most marginalized people.
That's a really good question. At risk of sort of homogenizing the populations we work with, I actually would say that it's not a problem, primarily because although it's on a blockchain, it's purposely designed not to require a smartphone. So the majority of people who use grassroots economics as a Sarafu network don't have access to the internet, right? They're using this, the old school, I think technically they're called dummy phones, but basically phones that aren't going to have apps or anything like that. And the experience, and I think this is where, obviously context matters, but the experience is purposely designed to feel like M-Pesa. And if you look at M-Pesa numbers in Kenya, I mean, the proportion of the population is over 100% because some people actually have multiple accounts. It's just ubiquitous at this stage. I mean, I personally don't know anyone who doesn't have it, and this is including people living in poverty in some of the most marginalized villages. But obviously I'm not Kenyan myself, so I can't really speak to that. But the experience would be a simple USSD menu, and that's something they can trade with. And when grassroots economics does go into these communities, they're doing onboarding community workshops where they'll be sitting down and walking them through using the phone. So I don't actually think that the technical access is the barrier. One barrier, though, that I think has come up is really just the amount of sort of on-the-ground onboarding work that is required. And, it's debatable whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, but, you can't just go into a community and airdrop it and say, we're going to create this new money. As I mentioned earlier, you really do have to do a lot of trust building, and that often will include things like speaking to village elders and having the village elders present at the workshop, right? Because that's a signal that this is something that kind of has that stamp of approval. If it's not the village elders, it might be the church groups, or it might be the women's savings groups, which locally we would call it Shama. Things like that, I think, are actually where there's the most resources and work required. And certainly there have been examples of villages and communities where that wasn't done very successfully. And as a result, you didn't see as much traction and engagement.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I didn't have my mic on. Thank you both. Vincent, you had another question.
Yeah, so like Charlotte said, for me, it's also quite an interesting and a very new area. I think I've never come to face to face with this sort of project. But again, what I'm thinking is, so this is this grassroots sort of currency thing project. I'm just wondering, so it is operating within the national context, a community that is within a national community, yeah? So how is on a national level, what is the response or what is the reaction? Is it something that as a country, they are following and have come to terms with? Or yeah, what is the relationship between the project within the community and at the national level?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, in the beginning, it was very bad. It was terrible, to the point that the entire staff team of Grassroots Economics was taken to court and thrown in jail. The government said, you're creating illegal tender. This is not something that we support. You can't just go into communities and print your own money. And that was a case, I think that happened around 2011, but that was very interesting because it set this huge legal precedent of who gets to create money. And I mean, this is an ongoing debate across the world with things like cryptocurrencies becoming more and more popular, right? Not just as an investment tool, but also like in this case, where it's something that's being used as on the day-to-day basis. And fortunately, you know, I don't think I'd be here if they had stayed in jail. They did actually win that battle, and the legal opinion was that, well, if you're going to ban things like community currencies, you would have to ban things like bus tokens and shop vouchers and gift cards, because from a financial standpoint, it's the exact same thing. It's simply saying, here is a token. It could be a piece of paper, it could be a gift card, or in this case, it could be a cryptocurrency, and this represents money that a certain group of people have agreed to participate and to use. And so because they won that, I mean, that was obviously a very important legal precedent, but they've been able to operate sort of within the law up until now, and hopefully that continues.
Thank you. Matthew, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Diana, and thanks to all the wonderful presenters. I love the presentations. I have a question for Rebecca. And my question, I was just wondering where the name grassroots economics come from, and what happens, that's the second part of the question, what happens if the people who are part of this network need to buy something outside of the community? In other words, the only currency they have is the one you are giving to them, but what they need is outside of that community. What happens to them?
Well, so the name, I think, was pretty representative of the kind of economies we're trying to build up. So grassroots, in the sense that it's not top down, it's bottom up. It's not something the government tells you you have to use. It's something the community decides they want to use. And the success of the currency and the entire local economy you create is obviously dependent on every single participant who's a part of that network. So I think that one, it's quite intuitive. And I mean, I personally love the word. I think the idea of grassroots economies is so contrary to how I'm a student of economics. It's so contrary to how we learn about economics as being this thing that the state controls. So that's about the name. And then to your question, so this has actually changed over the years. So there have been different design parameters. So in the beginning, there was just a blanket, you couldn't exchange it, right? Because it was a community currency, you wanted it to be a closed system. Now there's some more sophisticated ways of resolving that, because obviously people do sometimes find themselves in a position of, say, having, you know, $100 worth of community currency that you can't go and spend in bulk at someone that's not part of the network. They do now have something where you can actually exchange. You can't exchange your full wallet value because you don't want to have a situation where everyone is cashing out and liquidating, right? Because that would basically break the entire economy if everyone is exchanging for Kenyan shillings. And so now they do allow it within certain bounds, and also only under certain time periods as well.
Kofi, I'm glad you're going to ask a question, because I was going to say in the last few minutes I'd like to ask the panelists if each of you has a question for the other panelists. So I'll give Rebecca and Tebeje a moment to think about that. But Kofi, you ask your question.
Yeah, all right, thank you. My question is to Tebeje. My question is in relation to a disturbing finding from our research. And I just want to relate that to yours and ask you to comment on that. What came up so far is that even though they are asking for expansion, there is that disturbing issue at the community level where the African community-based organization do not see each other as partners that are working to help the African community. They see each other as competitors. One of the terms that came up is that they are territorial. Everybody is trying to protect their territory and undercut each other. In Ghana, we say that when you are advising the cat, you also need to advise the stinking fish. So there is a link between the cat going to steal your meat and then the stench from the fish inviting the cat. What I'm driving at is that your presentation about racialization of crime and stereotyping. Stereotypes do not emerge in a vacuum. There are always some basis for the stereotyping. And so my question is, to what extent do you think the African communities do bear some responsibility with regards to the crimes and the associations that are normally labeled against the African community, and what could be done to reduce that tendency?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, please.
Hopefully you do. Yes, I changed it to my mobile data now. Okay, it should be fine, I think. Okay, you are right. I mean, racial prejudice and stereotype, they don't just appear out of the blue, and there must be something. And my argument was, yes, there is something, for example, that constant and disproportionately high contact with the justice. But what about the underlying factor that generates that kind of behavior? Like, for example, that diminished sense of belonging, and as a result, self-isolation and disengagement. All those lead to oppositional attitude, and then, yeah, eventually to contact with the Justice Department, then in prison, and all. Then that feeds back to the discourse again, justifies Andrew Bolt's argument. So all that circle continues with that. But yes, well, obviously the community should take some form of responsibility, especially in terms of education. For example, one of the key findings in my project is there is lack of engagement from the African community, African parents with the school. And I appeared on SBS radio a couple of times just to communicate that message with the community, saying that it is really, really critical to keep, to establish strong relationships with the school, with teachers, so that you know where your kids are, what they are doing, what their aspiration is, what kind of help they need, what type of support you can provide from home. So yes, it's the challenge starts from the family, lack of engagement with the school and other activities, and then it grows into community and then society. As to community, I agree with you. There is that they don't talk to each other and they don't work together. The Eritrean community doesn't talk to the Ethiopian community, the Ethiopian neighbor to the Ghanaian or Liberian. So I don't know what the solution can be for that, but obviously events like this, even broader than this, community-based engagement and probably something from above can help. From the grassroots, I don't think that works, but some kind of policy direction or intervention just to establish some shared areas for mutual benefits within that community. But to just answer that question, should the community also take some? Yes, I agree with that, especially the families. Just my concern is at family level, the level of negligence in some households. I understand there are a range of factors for that, but this is your kid. You need to take a responsibility to engage with the school and that. And I visited a number of secondary schools interviewing teachers and career advisors. The key challenge those personnel mention again and again is lack of communication with parents, with families. I think the solution should start from the families, then go up to the community. But the challenge is there, but I don't know the answer, how to solve that miscommunication or not communicating at all within the communities. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kofi. Thank you, Tebeje. Frank has made a comment that I think is interesting to share in relation to what you were just saying, is that Bediako has made similar observations in 2016, blaming how the multicultural project has been implemented in Australia, that the state purposely pits community organisations focused on minorities against each other in terms of funding. That's that interesting, that sort of presence of the neoliberal web of control that is exacerbating harm. And then in contrast, we see from Rebecca's example this possibility of grassroots solutions, and as you're suggesting, Tebeje, in that the answers lie with the family. Perhaps it's that is indeed where the answer lies. I understand we've run 2 minutes over time. It's 6:32, and I would like to give the opportunity to you both, Rebecca and Tebeje, if you would like to ask a question of the panel or of each other, to do so before we close.
Actually, non-specific from me, but I suppose if any of you know of any communities that are interested in these grassroots economic solutions, not to use the name of organization, but just the concept of it, that would be very interesting to me. So I can definitely follow up with my details. Diana or Claire, maybe I'll share those with you.
Fantastic, thank you. Perhaps share them too with the African Studies group. With Kennedy and Matthew and Franca would be great. Tebeje, did you have a question?
Oh, thanks, Diana. I really don't know.
Okay.
It's been a long day, and
it has been a long day.
I really just to say thank you so much for sharing this session very effectively, and thank you everyone, my panelists and participants. I really enjoyed sharing my ideas with you guys. I hope we catch up again at some point somewhere.
Yeah, thank you all. It was really fantastic. I really enjoyed this panel. I love the strong themes that came out of community and this notion of grassroots power and the importance of connection and relationship and building trust over time. So thank you for bringing those threads out at this wonderful panel. Over to you, Matthew, to say goodbye.
Thank you, Diana, for doing the wonderful work of sharing. And thank you to all the panelists for your wonderful presentations, and to all the participants for a very engaged discussion. It was a pleasure to witness that myself. So it's been a long day, and wanted to thank you all for staying after this last session. We know you are tired and you need a good rest and have dinner. That's very important. So we'll let you go soon. But just before you go, I wanted to give a few announcements that tomorrow starts the practitioners panel day, and we have amazing panels through tomorrow. So it will be a kind of relaxed day, but it will be great that you don't miss any of the two panels. Wonderful panel. The first one will be looking at on support, how different organizations have contributed to support diversity and inclusion projects. And we have wonderful speakers who are coming from the university, private entrepreneurs, and charity organization who will be speaking tomorrow. So do us a favor to attend. And the second panel, again, wonderful panel that you should not miss, is coming with panelists who will be engaging with Prof. Mamdani's book, on which he gave the keynote lecture. And any questions that you had that you couldn't have opportunity to ask, please come to this panel. And we are very sure that you have the opportunity to engage with him and fellow panelists who are all amazing. If there are questions from any of my colleagues, then or any announcement they can make, otherwise I think I'm done and see you tomorrow.